In today's episode, I'm going to be covering probably one of the most well-known and most commonly documented caving accidents of all time, involving the fatality of John Edward Jones during his claustrophobic nightmare in what has become known as the Nutty Putty cave incident.
Being stuck in that position for going on 23 hours now.
Worked himself face forward through a series of tight passes.
This story begins in late November 2009, which would be somewhat of a special time for the 26-year-old medical student John Jones, who was back home in Utah with his family celebrating the festivities of Thanksgiving. During this family gathering, as they reminisced about the past, a suggestion was made to return to the adventures of when they were younger. Years ago, when John was a kid, his family would often make trips to caves as they provided a fun family day out, and it was something John and his brother really enjoyed doing. They had fond memories of traversing through cave systems and were certainly no strangers to the activity of spelunking. One example of this is when John was a kid, he had actually acted as a trapped survivor for the Utah rescue teams during their practice missions. Urged on by these nostalgic memories, John and his family decided they would arrange a trip down into Nutty Putty caves. A trip which would go horrifyingly wrong. At around 8 PM on November 24th, John, along with his adventurous younger brother Josh and a merry band of 9 friends and family, entered Nutty Putty Cave. The group started with the relatively tame big slide section, but John and Josh, the adventurous duo, wanted something a bit more challenging, so quietly they veered away from the main group, their sights set on the infamous birth canal section. The brothers, guided by their map, made their way through Nutty Putty Cave until they reached what John believed to be the entrance of the birth canal. It looked as if it would be a very tight squeeze to get through, but fueled by youthful memories, John plunged headfirst into the narrow tunnel and inched himself forward and down, wriggling through the tight passage. The walls constricted tighter around him, but John pressed on, convinced that he just has to get through this uncomfortable tight area and it will lead out of the birth canal. But as the tunnel tightened its grip, John started to realise that this can't possibly be the birth canal. He tried to move backwards, but due to the constriction on his body, it was completely impossible for him to move. John's predicament became horrifyingly clear. Trapped and almost completely upside down, he cried out for his brother, Josh, who also, without a second thought, jumped right into the tunnel to rescue his brother. But Josh became instantly stuck much further up from where John was, and as he peered down into the tunnel, he could just about make out John's legs. Realising the urgency of the situation that his brother was in, Josh managed to pull himself out of the tight passage and raced off to get help. But due to the area and the depth at which John was inside the cave, it took 3 hours for the first rescue workers to arrive. One of these rescue workers was Susie. She greeted John and asked him how he was. John replied that he'd really like to get out. Susie reassured John that everything would be fine and that she'd have him out in no time. As the doctors on site assessed the situation, they made it clear that John won't have long left in the current position he was in. Being a medical student, John was also probably fully aware of this. The rescue workers jumped into action, primarily Susie, who was down there with him. They started by simply putting a rope around his legs and trying to pull him out, but pretty quickly this proved to be ineffective. They then created a pulley system which they built into the walls of the cave, but it kept falling out of place, and the time it was taking just to move him an inch meant it was a painstaking process, although they were managing to pull him out a few inches over the course of hours, until eventually they would come into a problem. They weren't able to move John any further. The angle that he was lodged into the tunnel meant that he couldn't bend his legs to come out, meaning if they wanted to get him out, they would need to completely break his legs in the process. At this point, John was really struggling. With each breath he took, Susie could hear it in his voice that he didn't have long left. The rescuers came to the conclusion that if they broke his legs, he would probably go into shock and die before they could get him out. So tragically, 27 hours after John had entered that small tunnel, he would eventually stop breathing and be pronounced dead. When news of this reached the surface, John's wife couldn't believe it and insisted there must have been a mistake when checking for his pulse. But there was no mistake, and sadly, John would not be coming out of the cave. They sealed off Nutty Putty Cave with concrete and declared it shut forever. 3 years later, John's wife would remarry and make this statement.
I never would want bad things to happen, but in retrospect, we're given what we need. We're blessed. Life is still wonderful and beautiful and good, even though bad things happen, because Heavenly Father has a plan for us.
Which leaves the question of where exactly John fell into this plan, which only adds to the sorrow of John's tragic story.